Hello, everyone. Welcome to Know Your MIP, episode number 13. My name is Gala. I'm with Gov Alpha, and we are here today to talk about the MakerDAO Delegates MIP set. So the quick agenda, it's Peyton will walk us through the MIP set. So that's MIP 77, 78, and 79. And then we'll have a discussion. So before we move into that, I will go through the usual preamble. The call is being recorded, so we will try to not to speak over each other. You can raise your hands, use the chat, and this time I will ask you if you can to keep the questions for the end, for the discussion period, so we can try to focus on a productive discussion at the end. For sure, as much as possible. If you have like urgent questions, go for it. Yeah, and before we dive in, we thought of doing a little check-in that we call. So just try to kind of focus and be together into something that is kind of completely out of what we are doing right now. So I have a little question I'm going to ask you all, and if you can answer that, it would be awesome. So the question is, do you collect anything? I can start. So do I collect anything? I am kind of minimalist. I tend to do a lot of garbage just to get rid of all my stuff, but I temporarily collect stuff. So I can say I recently collected stones, very cool stones. Yeah, who wants to go? I can nominate someone. So I'm gonna nominate David. Go ahead. Do you collect anything?
Yeah, actually, I collect a handful of different things over the years. One of those things is knives. I have a nice collection of knives. I also have a collection of $2 bills. Every time I get a $2 bill from somewhere, I save it. And I think I have a good 50 or 60 now. And I also have an art collection. So I actually have, I think, about 20 plus pieces, many of which are like oil paintings, some are acrylic, some are like charcoal drawings, and yeah, and so those are my collections.
Nice, thanks for sharing. Do you want to nominate someone?
I nominate Joshua.
Yeah, I collect recipes, I would say, and try to develop recipes. So that's my thing.
Great. Do you want to nominate next person?
Oh, go ahead.
I was just going to tell you're muted, but I'll jump in. Happy to go. I was a pretty big rock collector. I feel like a lot of kids kind of like that's like your first thing you collect. That quickly evolved into coins for me and a fascination with money. So maybe that's how I ended up here. Still like to waste money on coins that'll never be worth anything, but I can tell a cool story about. I guess I'll ask Raphael. I'm curious. What do you?
Hey, so what do I collect? Actually, more like not physical things, like experiences and places, because I'm traveling a lot, so I can't keep a lot of stuff with me. Makes it kind of hard to like get deep into the actual collector's game. So that's it. Nominating Code Night.
Sure. I don't collect too much. I do like to collect, I guess, mementos from the different places I visited, like maybe like a coffee coaster or a mug or something. And I guess if I need to nominate someone, I will nominate Paper.
I collect money. I think Tim hasn't gone yet, so he can go.
What are you saying? What we collect?
Yep.
I mean, Post-its, dude. Product managers were the worst. I nominate Gala.
Yeah, I already said mine. It was stones lately. I think Kianga, it's you can go ahead. We are asking if you collect anything. What do you collect? Yes, stones. Tim.
You can also go, Matt, contemporary art we're getting from Kianga. Very
Okay.
cool. Go for it, Matt.
I'll jump in. I don't collect anything, but I tend to build up lots of books. And so I've recently moved, and so I don't have as many books as I would like, but you can see a small pile developing on the shelf next to me. So they have to be books.
Great, awesome. I think we all did it, participated. Cool. Great, so let's go back a little bit to what we are here for today. So thank you everyone for being here, for joining us. So the intention of the day, we are gathered here to explore the MIP set together. And we hope that at the end we get precious input to improve it, to find some common ground, and eventually sketch the final draft. So without further ado, you can go ahead, Peyton, if you are ready, to the presentation.
Okay, of course, I closed my one tab, so let me fix that before I press share. Problem with rehearsing, I guess. There it is. Okay. That looks to be the screen I want. Let's go full screen. Share. Nothing like your technological incompetence showing on a Zoom call, but I think we're up and running. Let me know if there's any problems seeing my screen here. All right, so ultimately we're here today to talk about the delegation MIP set. We really appreciate everyone coming out so we can have this call. Basically, our intention is to make sure everyone gets a chance to know what's in these MIPs and be engaged with their content. Desired outcome for this call, we would love to walk away feeling like people got their questions addressed, feeling like we got some good feedback for these MIPs, and just a general temperature check on like, hey, is this a MIP set that the community is generally supporting, is cautious to support, against, basically, we want to know. This is in request for comments phase, and we really do mean that, right? Like we want your comments, and we want to make this the best possible MIP set we can. So I really appreciate you all taking the time to come out here and help us make this better. So I thought it might be a little helpful before we get too into things, just to go over like a brief history of delegation at Maker to kind of figure out where we got here and why. In the quote unquote old days of Maker, I'm probably not old enough to say that, but at least in the old days of the DAO, it was really frustrating when you'd write a proposal because, you know, big whales would come in and vote. Most things would get accepted, but every now and then your thing would be rejected and you wouldn't know why. You know, sometimes VCs took the step of like coming to the forum and explaining their reasoning, which is really awesome. But most of the times, like, really it wasn't a priority for them, right? They're money managers, they're trying to make money in their investment, they're not trying to explain their reasoning on every vote that we put up you know, multiple times a week or what have you. So that kind of contrasts with the general decentralization roadmap of the protocol, and that's because like in order to be able to understand like sorry, not sure quite how to phrase that, but when the protocol wants to decentralize, right, delegation was always looked to be a key factor of that. And that's because when you're a delegate, you are someone who can say, hey, you know, I'm committing, I'm opting into being a person that votes for other people. You know, I'm willing to express my reasoning, to tell you what I think, why I'm voting. I want to gain more MKR and I want to use it. I want to put it to work. So that's just a much better state for governance in general, when people are able to tell you, you know, why proposals are rejected or engage in that feedback. So I linked a blog post on this. I can add the slides to our forum later, but this was a blog post from from the Maker Foundation and obviously Rune's input in it in, I want to say April of 2020. So this was a couple years old, and it was basically like, all right, well, for decentralization, we're going to need delegation. Fast forward a little bit, the foundation starts to dissolve. We still don't have delegation. So we kind of get to work to that, and the DAO as one of our first priorities from a governance standpoint. And we had the first delegate contract spun up in July of 2021. I think a few people in this room were awesome and were part of the kind of stakeholder calls we had when talking about the system and how we should put it into place. One interesting decision from that process was at the onset, there was no formal MIP defining what delegation was. That's because the process for creating a delegate contract was permissionless. And at the time that we spun it up, it also had no benefits. So it's like, well, we can put out these rules for what we think a recognized delegate should be, but at the time there's no benefits. Like there's no need to put it through a MIPS process when we basically don't even know what this is going to become, and it doesn't require MKR holders handing over anything as part of the process. But eventually kind of realized, well, if people are going to be spending a bunch of time for delegation, they should probably be paid. And kind of a broken assumption we had was that that would be sorted once there was enough MKR in the system. Essentially, we assumed, all right, well, all the delegates aren't going to like the fact that they're not going to be paid. So as soon as there's enough of them, they'll kind of come together and propose a compensation structure. But conflicts of interest, there's a whole bunch of reasonings why that assumption didn't quite pan out. And eventually we came with Josh, who is in the call, to work on MIP77, which defined our initial delegate compensation. That had a trial, at least one major upgrade to it, all that sort of thing. But that kind of gives you the groundwork for like, okay, well, how did we decide what delegates are, how they should be compensated to begin with? It really is just dog rooting this from the ground up. We started with the need for a contract, then the need for delegates, now the need to like pay and retain those people. All right. Cool. I'm just taking a quick look at chat, making sure I'm not missing anything. I think that's a pretty good transition into the actual MIPs themselves. So the three MIPs we're discussing today are 77, 78, and 79. They define the delegate role, DAI delegate compensation, and MKR delegate compensation, which is a new addition if accepted. So I guess like I tried to just grab the like really important overtones here. There's a lot of different items. They are a long MIP set. Sorry for being Gov Alpha and writing a lot of things that are dependent on each other. But here is kind of what I think is important to highlight at a base level for what MIP77 does. Obviously, it's really important that we define what it means to be a delegate. But at the same time, we don't want to say like what is a good delegate versus a bad delegate, right? Like obvious that they need to vote and communicate their votes for the problems I laid out earlier. But beyond that, like we don't really feel it's up to Gov Alpha to say, you know, this is what makes a good delegate, this is what makes a bad delegate. And it would be better if MKR holders could decide through their delegation. In the MIP, we define all these words: delegate, delegator, delegate contract, shadow delegate, recognized delegate. So there is actually like a MIP, if this were to be passed, that would say, hey, when we say this word, here's what it means. Same thing with becoming a recognized delegate. Like that's been a process run by Gov Alpha. So we've had documentation published on it. But up until now, it hasn't really been formalized and voted by the MKR holders. Only the compensation aspect was up until now. This includes the delegate code of conduct, defining some metrics, how they're tabulated, and even adds in a resignation process. Just one of the oversights, I think, of how we were first thinking of this. We're like, oh, well, people will just stop delegating and that'll be it. But, you know, there may be times where you wish to step down before people stop delegating to you. So this kind of helps clarify that. There are some like big changes in potential controversies from this one. The other two MIP slides I didn't make a slide like this for, and that's because I think we'll kind of be talking about issues of like money and compensation, which I think are pretty clear in terms of aligning incentives and us trying to figure out like, oh, is that too much or too little? But I did want to kind of highlight the changes to the system and potential controversies as they've been coming up. One that we had a lot of internal debate on was this changing metric tracking. Right now, delegates metrics are lifetime. Basically, every time they vote or don't vote from when they become a recognized delegate, that'll impact their score, and that score is what is displayed to people. We're changing that slightly and making the primary display a 12-month running score. So how you've been doing the past year as a delegate, if you're a recognized delegate, while still maintaining lifetime scores. Basically, this we think does a better job of saying like, okay, well, the last year is really the relevant part for how your delegate's been performing, right? If they voted in every single poll 2 years ago, that's probably not too relevant. Likewise, if they haven't voted in a month and a half, that's probably something you would want to have a pretty big impact on the display scores. Cool. So the other big thing, some of you might recall, this was a signal request by Hasu that had some controversy around it. We basically said, hey, we are kind of planning to put this into a forthcoming MIP, but as of yet, we don't have one. So Hasu kind of went through a signal process for a reset. That was declined by the community in part. It seemed, at least some of the feedback on the forum, was that they wanted to see a system that could be applied to everybody. So this is that system that GovAlpha brainstormed at least. It would allow delegates to request one metric reset per 12 months. So basically in the last 12 months, if you haven't used a reset, you could use one by requesting one on the forum, basically giving your reasoning saying, hey, I need a reset, XYZ happened to me, so I missed this many votes or what have you. And then it would ultimately be up to the governance facilitator's discretion. The intent here isn't to block like metric resets, but I don't know, the way it kind of interacts with the compensation formula, we basically just want to make it so people aren't trying to be like, well, I get one reset every 12 months, let's try to use it, I guess like aggressively or kind of from a plus expected value standpoint, rather than a like, hey, something happened to me and I needed this reset. It's potential that gets sticky. So that might be one area for feedback. I'd love to hear if it does make sense to leave it up to the governance facilitators for that final okay or not. I think there's trade-offs to doing either way, but this is ultimately the way we decided to go with MIP because it kind of adds a final layer of protection of like, oh, okay, something fishy is going on here, and now at least we're codified to stop it if we were to recognize it. Cool. Also clarifies that not voting for an executive will only hurt participation score if reasoning is not promptly provided. Some of you might recall in the Discord, this was kind of a back and forth with Chris Black when he first started as a recognized delegate. Particularly, he objected to the bundling of executive compensation because that incentivized that basically incentivize you to maybe enforce a change that you didn't initially agree with. Part of that's addressed later, but the part that's valid here is we said, okay, well, since there's no way to vote no on an executive, all you can do is not vote for it. If you provide your reasoning within 72 hours of that vote, then we will count it as participating because you at least let the community know that, hey, I'm not supporting this exec because of this. Which I guess, I don't know, I feel like maybe I'm bringing this a little too personal, but that's somewhat important for like me as a governance facilitator. Because like, let's say there's an issue where we can't get an executive passed, like I need to know why that executive isn't passing. Like, is it that one item is really controversial and the other three would be passed together? Yeah, and the only way I can know that is if people are telling us why they're not communicating or why they're not committing to an executive. And then another change kind of resulting from that back and forth is executives will now be weighted 5 times more than polls to kind of account for the fact that they are very important, but occur far less frequently than polls do. Okay, so that hopefully gave you an idea of the system changes we are making. Unfortunately, all these things do interact with each other quite a bit, which is why we're pushing them forward as a set rather than dropping them like one at a time. So I think it is important to start with the main one and get into the ramifications for these other things. For MIP78, recognized ICOM should be fairly straightforward for people already familiar with the MIP61 system. It essentially is taking that formula and adding in a maximum component as well. That's the only difference. Basically, well, that's the only difference in terms of like the formula, and then it's changing the parameters to the formula as well. So in terms of what that means for delegates, it is not a huge difference based on where your scores are at today. And that's because essentially what we did is we raised the maximum amount, the maximum threshold, and changed the slope of the quadratic curve there. So basically, you're able to get more compensation by gathering more MKR, but your present amount isn't changed too much based on this change, which was important to us, as we did want this to essentially allow for delegates to be more aggressive in courting MKR for delegation, but not penalize those who have already been participating in the system and want to continue to do so. One big change that affects delegates is these payments would now become quarterly instead of monthly. That is certainly a disadvantage if you're talking about becoming a recognized delegate to have your pay split up that much. However, we would hope it would become more sturdy because it would also dictate that delegate compensation payments are completely separated from other executive items. That, like, you know, this was what, 1 or 2 weeks ago, we had the situation where there was a delay in the vote being broadcast, a potential delay, and delegates receiving their compensation. And saw Kyung is on the call. She was expressing the kind of frustration with that system, which is quite understandable because in that particular instance, we had an item that had nothing to do with delegate compensation that was ultimately blocking the compensation from going forward. So while this would limit the number of payouts to 4 a year compared to 12, we would hope that they would be a little bit more consistent. You would know when they're coming. You know they'd be by themselves. So unless there was a true protocol level emergency, you wouldn't be subject to getting delayed for compensation. Excellent. I mentioned the cap. One kind of peculiar thing there is, like, it's really bad if the cap gets hit on the delegate comp in this, because it's an overall comp cap, which means that if you go over it, everyone's pay has to be reduced. So the idea there is that delegates in particular would be the most active stakeholders who might notice, like, hey, we've added a bunch of delegates who qualify for a bunch of compensation. If we don't change the cap, everyone's going to get slashed, you know, in the next quarter or what have you. So we believe that this setup does allow enough time for that kind of forward thinking to take place and say, okay, we've got an issue with the cap. Do we need to raise the cap? Do we need to adjust how we're paying delegates, and then move forward based on that? There's some clarification for metric calculations due to contract migration. I think that's mostly just relevant to people who want to be recognized delegates. Basically, this just makes it quite clear that, like, hey, migration shouldn't affect your scores. You know, we'll be adding the two voting weights together. We'll be keeping track of your voting participation on the contracts that you're able to vote from, and not the ones that you're not. All right, and then finally establishes a process for changing any of the compensation parameters. Right now, you have to go through like a MIP4 amendment, and yeah, it's a little bit more complicated than being able to change them specifically by signal, which this proposes. Cool. So now potentially the most controversial part of this is MIP79, which adds delegate MKR vesting. This isn't in the slide, but I do feel it's important to say this has been kind of a goal of Gov Alpha for a while. We don't have any opinion as to like what the split should be between DI comp and MKR comp. We've proposed levels that we think are reasonable based on community feedback, but for us, what it's really more about is this idea that MKR compensation is, especially vested MKR compensation, is much better for alignment than DI compensation. So having an element that is tied to the performance of MKR has been kind of a goal for our core unit, because we think it makes a more robust delegation system to have this in place, and that's why we're proposing it. We drew heavily from our own plan of how we propose MKR vesting for our team, and that's because we think it's a good plan that allows the DAO plenty of chances to intervene while also kind of being very crystal clear on how much MKR is being allocated, because it's based on how much DI has been earned over the period. That means that you know, it's a very simple math process. We say, all right, this much DI was earned. Here was the moving average over 12 months for MKR. That means the delegates are eligible for this much MKR vesting. That's preferable, in our opinion, to kind of a maximum cap of saying like, hey, you know, up to this amount, if all delegates were to join, you know, basically trying to say, all right, well, we can't have any more than this, but it'll be based on when people join. So we're going to ask the MKR holders to approve up to an amount and then clarify it later. It makes sense why you would want to do this as a core unit, but I think it's much less messy for the governance side to look at an actual amount of MKR to approve. Cool, I think I hit all the slide points except for the last potential most controversial is that it would apply it towards the entire history of the delegation program. This is in there because we don't think it's fair that the pioneers of the program would get left out by it. So we would be taking anyone who had been a delegate for up to 6 months before this passes and applying it backwards. For those who have been a delegate for less than 6 months, their time will kick in if this were to be passed when you cross the 6 month period. So this is just our way of accounting and making sure that everyone who has served as a recognized delegate can be treated fairly, and you know, particularly the people that took a chance on a new program aren't left out to dry when we compensate the people that came in later. Okay, my mouth is tired. I've been talking for a lot, and hopefully that wasn't like just a huge whatchamacallit, rant. Yeah, that's the word I'm looking for. So I am going to have a little break for an energizer here. Pass it back to Gala. We'll get engaging before we talk about some of the points I laid out.
Yeah, thanks, Peyton. That was cool. Yeah, so we're gonna do an energizer so that we can go ahead and do the discussion. So the idea of this little game is to once again come all together into an activity. So what's the goal here is to be able to count to 10. The thing is, how we're gonna do it is everyone is gonna turn off their cameras, and no one is allowed to speak like over each other. So we have to count to 10, and then if I say 1 and then someone goes 2, but then at the same time 2 people say 3, then we restart and we have to get to 10. Yay, so let's go ahead and start right now.
1,
2,
3,
4,
4,
1,
2,
3,
3. Oops.
1,
2,
3,
4,
5,
6,
7,
7,
1,
2,
3,
4,
5,
6,
7,
8,
9,
1.
2.
No, we can totally do it once again. Like, let's try it once again.
1,
2,
3,
4,
5,
6,
7,
8,
9.
10.
10.
Okay, let's say that 10, we could do it collectively. Like, that was the number we could all overlap.
YouTube will be so pleased.
Yeah, that'll be a fun little break in the recording.
Great, that was awesome. Thank you very much. So we can go ahead and start the discussion.
Yeah, let me get my slide back to the correct one. And yeah, the reason we do that, like, obviously it's hard when you can't talk, like you start doing social cues. I don't know if other people were like looking for mics. Like I realized I needed to wait and see if someone was unmuting, you know, little things like that. And I think it kind of helps us remember like how easy it is to like misinterpret, to speak over each other, to coordinate when you're not communicating. It's just really difficult. So I think that's a great lead into this discussion topic where we talk about like, all right, well, Bubba has this proposal. Like we worked really hard internally. We talked about a bunch of these things. We sought feedback from others. And we put it out in the community. But that doesn't mean that it's a good proposal. And really the judge of whether it's a good proposal is like kind of the input and the value of stakeholders. So I really appreciate everyone who's here on this call and want to give everyone a chance to kind of weigh in, ask questions, and just have discourse about this, if it's a good idea, if there are changes that would make it a better idea. We're also we will also listen if you think we need to put the brakes on and this thing isn't ready. So I just kind of want to iterate like this is as much the community's proposal as it is ours. And yeah, thank you for being here and for helping shape. Okay. That looks like Discord. Interesting, because I made it full screen. It's confused. Sorry about that, folks. All right, I'll make it full screen. So obviously these three proposals have been in the RFC period for a little bit of time, which means we have got a lot of feedback on them on the forum. I tried to grab like salient points and questions and condense them on here. If you don't see your point, it's not because I didn't think it was good, just because I was trying to quickly grab as much as I could from the three different threads. So some feedback was that there's still no availability requirements for delegates in the case of like emergency, right? Like we don't say, hey, you have to always be able to respond in X amount of time. That might be a good thing to add in for expectations of recognized delegate. It also might not. So I think that's potentially all these are good jumping off points for the discussion. If any of them speak to you, great. If they don't worry about them. I'm just gonna run through them real quick and we'll see what the group here wants to talk about. We had a question of, shouldn't we be incentivizing like good voting, not just voting in general? Heard feedback that if we're talking budget freezes for core units, should we really be talking about increasing max delegate comp? A lot of talk about compensation in general, right? Like, are delegates underpaid now? Like, how much should they be paid? Particularly if you add in MKR pricing, are they overpaid? And then finally, like, are we comfortable with this idea that you can self-fund a delegate, right? Like either by delegating to yourself, or maybe you have a friend, you have a bunch of MKR, you can essentially encourage them to go through the delegation process, give them your stack of MKR, and you've kind of just hired someone to work for a DAO. On the governance end, that's like exciting, right? Permissionless, you can just onboard someone. But it's also potentially dangerous, right? Because people with access to MKR can just decide that the protocol is now going to start paying all the people they decide to give their MKR to. And that's the trade-off we're dealing with. Cool. So I think that does a pretty good job of framing some of the feedback, and I bet we'll have more here. I've already seen some questions come in. So I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing, and we'll go to general discussion. Gala, I don't know if we want to start with maybe some of the questions that came in earlier, or if you have a preference how we do that.
You mean on the chat right now?
Correct. I saw a few coming in earlier.
Yeah, there was. You answered a little bit to Kianga. That's right. Then there was Code Knight concerned about the precedent retroactive compensation sets for core units. How do we distinguish between good and bad requests for retroactive compensation?
That's a fun question for me to answer because I get to do the governance. It's like, well, it's up to you guys to decide. But to try to say something helpful on the matter, the way the system works, people can always propose things retroactively, and in some cases, it's better, right? Like to be able to say, hey, you weren't sure if this was going to work out, so I took the liberty of doing all this work. Now it's been completed, and I would like to receive compensation for it. That can be a totally normal and perhaps even preferable route to go for some things. The issue is we don't know without polling the community and asking what times that would be more appropriate or less appropriate. So I think the work kind of speaks for itself to a certain extent, right? Like anyone can ask for a retroactive request, and if a bunch are getting requested, it'll probably encourage more people to request them. But I will say so far, we haven't seen that many retroactive requests, and of the ones that we have seen, the community has been fairly supportive of them. I would hope that, like, I wouldn't want that to be the element that sinks this MIP set, in particular because, like I said, especially for early delegates, they really did go out on a limb and say, all right, well, we don't know if we're going to get paid, how that's going to happen. Like, we want to participate. We're taking on all this legal risk, and like, let's go. Let's try and do something. Totally fine if the community thinks it's not appropriate to compensate that, but we did think about our reasoning for including it in the proposal and felt it was justified. Scrolling through one chat.
Yeah, there was also, well, Rafael just wrote, how can we mitigate conflict of interest here?
Yeah, so basically the question is, like, kind of delegates voting on their own comp is super, like really not an easy thing to do, because of course, like, I mean, I love getting paid, right? So like, I wonder if you kind of have some thoughts about how to approach that.
Definitely, and yeah, I think the first step is to acknowledge that it is a sticky situation, right? You guys are the people that vote most frequently in the protocol and that vote with a particularly large weight. our arguments essentially in the past in terms of why, you know, we don't have specific rules about if delegates can vote in matters of delegate comp or any of that stuff is, well, I mean, there's a few different arguments, but one that I personally kind of took to was, you know, these are the people that are kind of in control of the protocol. A few of them can already collude to do things, and in particular, we trust them with a lot of changes and other things that could potentially break DAI, right? If, you know, we think about worst case scenarios and bad decision making, you know, essentially some delegate decisions could destroy a decent portion of the DeFi ecosystem. So we feel like the responsibility and the call to being a delegate is already quite high. Having to vote on your own pay doesn't seem like it is exceeding that level at all. I understand it's sticky for those that are involved, and especially for outsiders looking in, it's like an easy point to say like, oh, you know, conflict of interest, people are paying themselves, that sort of thing. But ultimately, like, delegates are the decision makers in the protocol. They have to be trusted to make decisions based on their delegators, and the fallback is essentially, well, if they were to propose something or approve something too extreme for themselves, assumedly their delegators would hear about it and then undelegate from them, and then the next batch of delegates could fix that overstep.
Yeah, I think that's a fair point, really. Also, like, I thought a little bit about like alternative mechanisms, but like, I think everything gets so convoluted once you go down that path that I think just sticking with the system and just trusting it is probably best. For me, like the MKR vesting issue is like Code Knight had that point. It's like it's tying into some difficulties with that we see like across the board, not just with MKRs. Like, how are the MKRs priced? What's the cliff? What's the vesting? Is it a stream or a payout? So, like, personally, I've said that in the chat, I'd like less DAI and more MKR compensation. I think that's just aligning interests well, and also probably even having a cliff and then a vest over a longer period, so that there's like really that thing. But I think we already discussed that. One more thing that I just have thought about is like, if you think about delegates as like protocol politicians, then have you thought about like term limits to delegates? Does that make sense? Or
Yeah, that's certainly a valid consideration. That is kind of in a roundabout way why the delegate contracts expire every year. That's kind of like a pseudo term limit, I guess you could say, is because, all right, well, every year at the very least, if they're going to keep their voting weight, their delegators have to reaffirm that they want to keep it with them. So that's not so much a term limit as it is a re-election, I guess, but hopefully functions in a similar way. We're still young, so I think it would be kind of hard to come up with what might be a good term limit right now. Like, you know, do we follow politicians say 4 years? It's like, well, delegation's been around for a little over one, and was in really nascent stages in the start. So I'm not sure if we're ready to make that call on what an appropriate time frame is for a maximum. Yeah, that's why it's not in there. Have considered it, but ultimately kind of think that delegate migration, the need to reaffirm your choice, at least solves for the issue of people just passively going along with whoever is there at the moment. And go for it, Josh.
Yeah, I wanted to speak to this briefly. So term limits is an idea, like we can already do term limits. People, you know, Maker could just undelegate from the delegates every now and then. So I think what you mean term limits is kind of like a default agreement that you know, delegates will only serve for a certain amount of time. So it's basically like adding something like term limits basically changes the defaults. But we'd still want to be able to, for really outstanding, helpful delegates, we'd want them to be able to continue serving And for delegates that aren't really doing a great job, we'd like them to be, lose their influence sooner than the term limit expiring. So I guess what I'm trying to say is that having something like term limits is it mostly just changes like it sets like a default amount of time for these kinds of decisions to be made, but it doesn't really change the ability of Maker to delegate and undelegate whenever they want. I mean, and then the other thing I guess is like job security. Like delegates want to know that they're that they can assume that they will have Maker compensation for some default amount of time. But again, in the political arena, we have these things called recall elections that could be, in some jurisdictions can be triggered by a certain number of petitions. So again, it's a really a question of defaults, whether we want to default to having a certain amount of time or not, and whether we have those defaults or not, like the actions of a delegate staying in office or being forced to leave office is we still have that ability to make that happen, whether we have these defaults or not.
Thanks, Josh. Yeah, so there's obviously a lot to consider, and then there's enforcement to that side as well. But that doesn't mean that like the trade-offs weren't worth considering for sure. So thanks for bringing it up. So David asked if there are any bench rates yet for delegate comp. Says he knows Optimism has delegates, and a lot of different places have delegates as well. I might actually call on Paper here, as I think you might have the most recent experience with looking into other systems. But on our end, I was going to pay one of our GovAlpha contributors to look into it, and essentially was that there are very few other systems for compensating delegates, and the ones that do exist, at least in my assessment, were largely based off of our formula. Like I said, I know Paper and GFX.
Yeah, that's correct.
Cool.
Yeah, there's no compensation at Optimism yet. They are about to launch committees, which the committees will have some compensation, but delegates overall won't. And the committees are, I think, are just for a trial period of 3 months or 2 months. We are GFX and Flipside and another delegate are actually about to propose a compensation program at HOP, but again, as Peyton says, it's kind of modeled after Maker, or at least at the very beginning.
Aave is thinking about something as well, but the proposal I've seen in draft is also quite similar to ours. They want to innovate on that though, like they see our model as like kind of the starting block to then think about, which I think is amazing. So yeah.
Yeah, it's a cool problem to have for sure. It's like, well, we're kind of groundbreaking, and I see people mostly copying us. But yeah, it does make it a little hard when you're trying to say like, all right, well, what's a fair number? It's like, well, really depends what your benchmark is. I guess this might be a good time to address too. When we presented on the GNR, there's like some pushback that like maybe we were presenting this because we felt like the delegates weren't good enough. So hopefully defended ourselves on that call, saying like that's couldn't be farther from the truth. What we do think is there is like a very tangible limit to like how far a single person can go as a delegate, right? Yeah. Yeah, sorry, I was laughing at the can't count to 10 comment from our exercise earlier. But yeah, so there's a limit to like how much as one person you can really do, just in general, and particularly as a delegate. Obviously, one way to combat this would be to form a delegation team. And we've in fact seen several teams join Maker for that purpose. However, our compensation strategy or allocation, however you want to describe it, was like very clearly meant to be like one decently paid person running the delegation. So we felt like there's some incongruity there, and like we felt that the comp parameters might have been kind of artificially capping the capacity of delegates. At least that was kind of our suspicion, because like I said, if your all max salary is 144K, you can maybe hire one more person out of that, plus you, depending on what your circumstances are, maybe 2 or 3 if you're in a cheaper place. But basically, with the cap at 144K annually, the amount of outside help, whether it's legal or research or even just assistive, right? Like, I mean, I know I get a ton of messages, so I can't imagine how many messages delegates get as well with people advocating for their programs, that sort of thing. So yeah, roundabout way of saying like, not meant to be a take on the professionalization level of delegates, but rather an acknowledgement of the type of like self-selection we set up the initial program. Basically, if you were someone who's really interested in Maker, it was very attractive because you could really leverage that personal knowledge a lot. But if you wanted to have broader ecosystem effects, I think it is quite clear that, you know, we look at core unit budgets, for example, we see that like there's very few that come in under $1 million a year, and that makes sense because core units hire multiple people and they do multiple things. So if we're capping our delegates at 144K, we're kind of severely limiting their potential output of how they would like to pursue delegation. Cool. That's a bit of a rant, sorry, but do feel it's important to acknowledge that we are very appreciative of the delegates we have, and particularly the risks that they've taken on a new system. And our primary goal is just to design a really good incentive mechanism that rewards people that are willing to put in more time and effort towards being a delegate.
So we are getting close to the end of the call. Is there any like last question or comment? I see Kianga is writing a comment there.
Yeah, that's a pretty good one too, if you don't mind me stepping in, Gal. Basically, the question is like, how much available MKR, and it's not really asking that, but making the point that it seems like there's not a lot of available MKR to bring into the governance contract. Yeah, I think that's something paper has echoed before as well, between like custody concerns, just general funds holdings, liquidity pools. It's hard to increase that overall number of MKR. And yeah, I guess I have a few different feelings, right? Because I do suspect that the quote unquote easy sources are largely gone, right? Like people are aware of them. They can apply to like A16Z or, you know, speak to the funds that hold large funds, but it's like pretty apparent where the super available ready to vote MKR is, and it's kind of just been being passed around between delegates for the most part in the contract. However, new capital can always buy MKR from these liquidity pools, right? There's just a ton of it just sitting out there waiting to be swapped. So that's one avenue for pursuing more MKR. We're also seeing more MKR vesting for core units. Now we're proposing it for delegates as well to be released. So we expect that would be MKR that's also highly motivated to participate, if to not delegate outright. But yeah, frankly, we don't suspect anyone to hit the new cap of I think it was 30K MKR that we propose. At least not immediately, because yeah, there's just not a lot to go around. So unless some of the major holders decide to concentrate their holdings, which isn't advisable to them, we'll probably still struggle to get much higher than, I don't know, 15-20 seems to be like kind of a reasonable maximum at the moment. Yeah, Mark having a comment that we should partner with exchanges to facilitate smaller delegations. Yes, I think that would be hard. doesn't mean we shouldn't do it. But just getting them to integrate the custody platforms was quite difficult on our end. So I imagine enabling smallholder delegation would be an even greater lift. Oh, I see Raphael mentioning that'd be cool if delegate MKR could still be used for something besides voting. Yeah. And I can get jazzed up and keep talking governance things all day, but I will let you do your wind down.
Sure. So thank you very much, bros. Thank you everyone for joining. Let's keep the discussions going on in the forum. And we are having a call right after this one. So meet your delegate number 18 with Yano, Ahmad, and Zid. So if you can join us, that would be awesome. I'll drop the link here on the chat. Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you, Gala, for hosting, and everyone for coming out. Really appreciate you leaning into our participation and having an engaging call. See you next time.